It goes back a long way. It goes back to my childhood. I was fortunate to grow up in a compound with a big family, and we have grandmothers and mothers and lots of children. And the grandmothers would sit us down in the night under the moonlight and tell us stories, folk tales mostly. And that's really how I came, to have a relationship with stories. They would tell us, folk tales and sing the songs and do the voices of the animals, and dance and sing. So that captured my imagination as a child. I would say I was like 7, 6, 5, even 4. And that was how I encountered stories. And it made sense to me, something about stories kind of explain the world, the way the world works, in a kind of structured way. Because story has beginning, middle, ending, so it kind of made me see the world in that way, with a middle, with a beginning, with an ending, something with structure. That's really, I think, my relationship. That's how it started when I was a child. I don't break down, influences into speech, into stories and all that. I just take them as a whole. I don't think spoken word per se, caught my attention the way stories did. I was particularly drawn to stories because of the structure and the way they hold your attention, I don't think when I was a child there was much, speech giving or people making speeches in the way that you have like oratory, It's just ordinary day, everyday speech. But as a writer, of course, these things figure in your writing because you learn to listen to how people speak, the mannerisms of speech, the style, the emphasis they play. And that you do it unconsciously. You don't even think about it. It's something that just kind of develop characters. You want to differentiate them. And you take certain mannerism of speech from actual people and you give it to these characters. So somehow, somewhere along the way, speech must have made an impact on me. But it's a totality of everything. The speech, the story, and the structure, and everything kind of came together without me kind of isolating them individually. They just kind of come together. Well, it's a natural progression. From the oral storytelling, I went on to learn how to read, because I was listening to oral stories before I could read. So after I started reading, I just went into reading stories immediately. I was lucky. In my household, there was a lot of books. My father had books. I have older brothers, who were also reading novels. So there were books every day, all the time in our house. And there was also the Bible. And I would read the Bible, like from beginning to wherever. I would just keep going. I read it like a novel. So there's a lot of literature in our house. And I think I started reading when I was like age 7. That was when I started reading books. And I never stopped. Really, I never stopped. I would lock myself up in the room and read like all day until my mother would come and tell me, what are you doing? You should go out, go and play, things like that. But I was reading, from the moment I started learning how to read, I just went on reading, I never stopped. I think I was fortunate, I was very lucky to have a family, like mine, people who love to talk to each other, who love to tell stories, who saw storytelling as a form of entertainment. Instead of television or other things, people actually sit down and tell stories and listen to each other and perform for each other. So I was fortunate. I don't know if I would have become a writer if I didn't grow up in my house, in my family. But maybe somehow along the way I would have discovered literature on my own. But I think that early influence, it brought my imagination alive. And I think a child's imagination is very powerful. And once you go on that path of imagination and imagining and telling stories, you never stop. It changes the way you look at the world. The world becomes a more structured place. I've used the word structure so many times. It's important for me, that structure, beginning, middle, ending. The world is so random and chaotic, and I think stories kind of give it purpose. Somebody said that we as human beings, we are storytelling creatures. That's what we are. We tell stories. That's what human beings do. I think we tell stories because we need to comfort ourselves. We need to have a sense of purpose. Imagine the prehistoric man, the caveman, after working all day, hunting, they will come back and they will tell stories. You know, that story is something that is so powerful, that's binding them together, that's making sense of all the activities that they've been through throughout the day. That's a kind of analyzing of that activity, a kind of regurgitating of that activity and kind of trying to make sense of it. It's not just a random thing. The story gives it purpose and meaning. And I think that's what happened to me as a child. And I realized that even though I didn't see it in the way I'm saying it now, somehow in my brain it kind of registered that this is meaning. This is something that could save you if you just hold on to it. It will give you a life direction. And I think it did for me. I'm conscious of myths, mythologies. I read literature, at university, and you can't escape the Greek mythologies. And growing up, listening to my grandmother tell stories, you cannot escape the African mythologies, and the proverbs and the folk tales. And I think if you want to be a good writer, you have to master the folk tales, the folk ways of your people and of the language in which you're writing. So I was conscious of that. And I read as widely as I could, and I listened, to as much of the mythologies I could lay my hands on as I could. And once in a while, even if you don't use the mythologies themselves directly in your writing, you allude to them, and you have this reference material or reference stuff there at your fingertip, and you know that you can make use of them anytime you want. So they're always there as resource for your storytelling. So it's very important, even if I don't use them, even if I don't put them in my stories consciously, I'm aware of them as a resource that I could draw on. And it's always helped me. And it kind of makes things more meaningful, because mythologies, they try to explain things. That's what myths do. Legends, they try to explain phenomena, and it helps. That's what storytelling does too. Storytelling is like one big mythology. When you write a novel, it's like one big mythology that you are creating. So it's useful to me in so many ways. Yeah. I actually write my story in my head before I even put it on paper. So I think about it for a long time. My process is, I have a story in my head, and I keep it in my head for about 1 year, 2 years. I actually write my story in my head before I even put it on paper. So I think about it for a long time. So while I'm working on one novel now, there's another one in my mind that I'm actually writing in my head. And of course, everything in your head is much better than when it actually goes on paper. So when you begin to write it, it looks not as beautiful or not as perfect as what you had in your mind, was. So there's that disappointment, but you begin to work on it. You begin to change it. And it becomes something that is different, but it's also unique and beautiful, even though it might not be as perfect as the one you had in your mind originally, but it becomes something new, which is a surprise, which is also the joy of creating something as a writer. But I think as I get older, as I write more and more books, I'm becoming more conscious of what I'm doing. I'm less instinctive, less intuitive. I'm trying to be more conscious. I try to plan the structure of the novel, the way it will look, and how it's going to pan out eventually. My first novel is set in Lagos, in Nigeria. And I was living in Lagos then, and I set the story in Lagos. So that had an influence, direct influence of what I saw, what I felt. I was instinctively reacting to the environment. Lagos is a big, crazy city in Nigeria, and there's a lot of brutality, a lot of violence. And I think writing that novel, setting that novel in Lagos was my response, my attempt to understand my environment at that time, to make sense of it. And the funny thing is that when I first thought of the story, it was not set in Lagos, it was set in northern Nigeria, a different part of the country, quieter, calmer, less chaotic place. But then I moved to Lagos when I started writing the novel. And I decided to change the setting and put it in Lagos because I saw that Lagos was the place for that story. And my second novel is set in northern Nigeria, a more calmer, quieter place. And I think because I wanted the novel to be like that, I wanted it to be a reflective, kind of a historical philosophical kind of novel. And I think the setting helped with that. It's a rural setting where people have the time to think, and to cogitate and do things like that. And my last novel, Oil and Water, is set in the Niger Delta. It's about the oil industry, the environment, the violence that accompanies the activities of the oil extraction, and the protest movement that kind of try to fight the oil companies for polluting the environment. So it's directly about environment. Environment and story kind of go hand in hand, literally, in this story. So I'm always conscious of place. Place is not place. Place influences people. Not just me as a writer, but my characters are influenced by place. The pace of the story influenced by place. The ending, the outcome of the story is influenced by place. So place is very, very important, both on me as an author and on the story and the characters. I think the first one, about Lagos, got such positive response from people, especially young people who were about my age when I wrote it. I was in my 20s, late 20s when I wrote it, and I published it when I was 30, 31. I was trying to capture the environment in which we grew up, the military dictatorship, the violence, of that time, and the lack of democracy, lack of freedom, lack of human rights. These are the things that my first novel talked about. And I think people of my age who experienced that kind of unfreedom, if you want to call it unfreedom, reacted viscerally to what I described in the book. They saw it as their story. They saw themselves in the story. And I actually use real characters, from friends to family, things like that. I always do that in my novels. I put people that I know in my stories. And they loved it. They understood what I was trying to do, and they respected it. So I think it kind of achieved its purpose. The second one, Measuring Time, is, like I mentioned, in a northern part of the country. And actually students study in universities and secondary schools in Nigeria. And in that novel, I actually describe my hometown in northern Nigeria. Though I use a different name for the town, but it's an actual place, and I describe everything there. So I'm using my own history. And people who understand, the history, who understand what I was trying to do, they really love it. And even those who don't understand it, they feel the authenticity. And I think it's one of my most successful novels, because I keep getting letters from people all the time about how they see the place, about how they see the characters in that place. And I think for me, the least successful in terms of environment and reaction from people, especially Nigerians, is my last novel, Oil and Water. And it's not because I didn't capture the place or the authenticity of the place. I captured it too well. I think that's really the problem. Because it's such a topical, contentious issue, and there's division. Some people like what I did in the book, some people didn't like what I did in the book, depending on where they stand on the issues of the environment, of violence, of crime in the Niger Delta. So there's been kind of mixed reaction, and people have been quiet about it in Nigeria, but outside Nigeria, it's been very successful. In Germany, in America, in England, people really respond to it like really very, very well. I think because of the issues. For them, it's a very important issue. It's important, of course, to Nigerians, but it's very, very divisive. That's really the difference. I was listening to the stories that, my grandmother was telling me at home. And then when I go to school in the morning, we had a period of 1 hour that students are called forward by the teacher to come and tell stories to the class in vernacular, in Nigerian language. And I would tell the stories I heard from my grandmother to the class. And they were excellent stories, because I would change them and perform them, and I became like a champion storyteller in primary school. So I was doing both at the same time, listening to stories and creating stories at the same time. But of course, with oral storytelling, you don't really create stories. You retell stories, you perform it. When I went to university, I started writing stories because I was reading literature. And I went to university because I wanted to be a writer, really. So I read English and literature at university. And I published my first short story in a newspaper when I was in my second year at university. Before I went to university, I wrote a novel at home when I was 17 years old, but it never got published. It's still there somewhere in a box in my mother's house. But the point I'm making is that I was writing and listening to stories and reading at the same time. Because the moment I started enjoying stories, all I wanted to do was also to tell stories, to create, to be a writer. I had never met a writer. I had never met a published writer. Of course, I had met my grandmother. She was a storyteller. She was, in a way, a writer. But I mean writer in a conventional sense. I had never met one. I didn't know what writers do. But I wanted to be a writer because of the books I was reading. And then I went to university, of course, and started writing short stories. They were not very successful, even though, like I told you, I was able to publish one or two. But I kept on. I kept at it. I never gave up. I knew that writing was going to take time. Writing I saw as something that was so, it has to be excellent, it has to be perfect. It has to be, it's the most important thing. So I was not going to rush it. And I knew it was going to take a while before I became the kind of writer I wanted to become. So I was very patient. And all the stories I published, they were almost accidentally published, you know. I just sent them off. I didn't think much of them, but they got published. But even then I was not satisfied, you know, in the sense that I didn't see myself as a writer per se. And I only saw myself as a writer when I really got a book contract with my first novel. And I held my contract in my hand after writing my first novel. I was, you know, 30, 31. So I think that was when I saw myself as a writer. So it was always going to be a long process for me. People read books one at a time. That's why it has to change one person at a time. It's interesting. Yeah, the distinction is very interesting because writing is different from discovering a voice. You start writing, then eventually begin to know what you're writing about. A point comes when you are confident enough in what you're doing and you see that there's a kind of consistency, a kind of continuity, if you like, of subject matter, of central concern, of imagery, or of symbolism, something that keeps recurring, then you know that this is what you have been aiming for. This is the voice that you've been trying to project. I think I'm just beginning to discover that voice now. I've written 3 novels and lots of short stories and poems. And I think it's only now that I'm really beginning to get really confident and say that, yeah, this is what I'm saying, and this is the way to say it, loudly and confidently and aggressively, you know. I think I'm just beginning to do that. And I think with my next novels, it's going to go on a different level now. So the first 3 novels, I think I was just experimenting. I was trying to discover who or what I was trying to do, who I was trying to become. Some artists are more honest than other artists. There are artists who would deny any political motive or inclination or even political presence in their writing. Even if you write the most domestic of stories about a husband and a wife, there's always going to be politics. Because once 2 people come together, you're talking about power relationship. You know, who is the breadwinner? Who gives the orders in the house? How do they live? That is politics. So politics is in degrees. There are degrees of politics. I don't think what I'm trying to do is politics or being political. I'm just trying to create something that will create awareness in people and entertain them and educate them and teach them something that they didn't know, to awaken something in them, a kind of spark. That's what I want my novels to do. When you finish reading my novel, I want you to put it down and say that, yeah, I can do something in this world, you know? It's like a light bulb. I want a light bulb to go off in your head, and you can say, I can change this world. I can do something with this world, with myself in this world. I think that is political. That's the politics I'm kind of aiming for. A people who kind of see their situation and realize they are not hopeless or powerless. Whether it's individuals or as a group, they see that, oh, we can do much, much more than we've been doing or than people think we could do, than people give us credit for. We're more powerful than people thought we were. I want people to kind of feel free when they finish my book. So that's politics, I guess. So yeah, that's That's very political. We mustn't aim for much. I think authors are very modest people. They are modest because they sit in this tiny room alone before their computer or their piece of paper or whatever, trying to tell a story, trying to create a universe out of nothing, out of their imagination. Very ambitious, you might say, but also very modest because they have no certainty that it's going to work. They don't know if it's going to fail, and most of the time it fails. Maybe no one will hear of it. When it gets published, it's going to disappear. But once in a while, you find important books, something comes of it. It has to be from the individual. It's not like an orator speaking on a podium, to millions of people to change them. People read books one at a time. That's why it has to change one person at a time, because it works in that person, and then the person maybe gives the book to another person, and then over time, it might even take 10 years or 20 years before a book begins to be fully felt. That's how books work. Maybe some authors are even recognized after they are dead. People like Herman Melville, who wrote the Moby Dick, died penniless, and he thought he was a failure because nobody respected his book. Nobody thought it was a great book. But now when we talk about Moby Dick, it's like the great American novel. Over time, people have come to see what kind of book it is. Shakespeare wasn't that respected in his time, even though he was, successful. But people used to say that he didn't know Greek or Latin, so he was like some kind of ignorant hack. And the respected people of that age were Christopher Marlowe, Ben Jonson, who were more educated. But now, over time, people have come to respect Shakespeare more than Ben Jonson or Christopher Marlowe. That's the way books work. That's the way culture works. It takes time. It's not going to change things in a minute. I want the person who reads that book to feel as if, a ray of sunlight has entered a dark room in which he's sitting, and he just sees kind of fresh air. He feels the fresh air and sees the sunlight in a different way. That's really what I hope my books will do. Writing, storytelling is one of the most significant, the most meaningful, arts or process or production that human beings have created. We try to make sense of the world through telling stories, through repeating stories. Even though we know the story, somebody will come and tell you the same story, but the telling is so exciting to you because you will sit down and you listen and you get the same thrill from that same story. So it tells you that it does something to your brain, And I think each one of us has a story to tell. We all have something that we believe in, something that only us can tell in that particular way. That's my belief. I see the world as a big conversation that all of us have to say something, lend our voice to. And people do it in different ways. Some people are soldiers, some people are politicians. That's the way they lend their voice to this huge conversation that goes on in the world. Some people are teachers. Some people are writers. That's the way they lend their voice to this big global dialogue that's going on every day. Once a story is created, it's there forever. It never dies. It's like creating something that was never there, and it comes into existence. You have that power of creation with words, just merging word to word and creating a universe. It's the most marvelous thing, that you can do. Our brain actually needs stories. It needs that validation, that reassurance, that repetition, that assurance that there's a structure, that there's a meaning to life. And I think that's what reading does to you. You share that experience with the character in the book, and you do it one at a time. You sit down, just you and that character, and you read it. And something about the character kind of touches you, and you see yourself in that book. And you realize you're not alone. There are people like you in this world. And there's a change that comes over you. There's a more, you feel lighter, You feel more positive about life. Even if it's a sad story, there's a meaning behind it. And it makes you understand how the world works, that it's not total chaos. There's a structure, there's a plot, there's a direction to how life works. That's what reading does to you, I think.